Okay, first of all, thank you very much for the introduction. It's a real pleasure to be here. Let me just get my talk called up. Yeah, it's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you very much to Lucy and to Jonas for all the work that they've done putting this event together. And I want to thank also Ignacio and Silke for the invitation to speak with you about the concept of the root in relation to the Anthropocene. This is a concept that I hadn't ever really worked with before, and it kind of came out of nowhere to me. And I embraced the challenge. I wasn't quite sure what to do with this concept. But over the course of writing this paper, it became clear to me that this is actually a really wonderful concept to work with and useful for doing the sorts of things that I'm interested in. So what I'd like to do today is expand on some of the ideas that my colleagues Delf Roff and Christiana Froelich and I posited in a special issue of the journal Mobilities from a few years ago on the topic of Anthropocene mobilities. In particular, I want to develop the notion that the concept of the route is not simply the passage one takes between two fixed locations, but that in the geological context of the Anthropocene, the route must instead be reconceptualized in relation to the planetary. The route is not a simple line one follows, but a full manifestation of the planetary, and thus a bearer of planetary significance. Specifically, I want to suggest that we approach the route as a manifestation of what Catherine Youssef and Nigel Clark would call a geosocial formation. Routes are, in this sense, regimes of social motion, to borrow Thomas Nail's phrase. Regimes of social motion that both shape and are shaped by the geological forces that comprise the planetary. The specific route I want to consider today is the pattern of labor migration from South Asia to the Gulf, and in particular the United Arab Emirates, which not insignificantly will be hosting COP28 next month in Dubai. That we cannot grasp the significance of this migratory route without also understanding it in relation to the vast hydrocarbon economy of the Gulf, as well as the geological underpinnings of the US dollar, is precisely what makes this route a geosocial formation. Our challenge will be to think this migratory route as an expression of the planetary. However, before excavating the planetary dimensions of the route, let me first contextualize this task by saying something about how I situate myself intellectually. I don't really consider myself a scholar of either mobilities or the Anthropocene. Rather, my bread and butter pursuits have been much more focused on theorizing the relationship between climate change and human migration, which I became interested in because I felt it had something important to teach us about the way that European humanism is adapting to climate change in relation to its non-European other. The core argument I make in my recent book is that the discourse on climate change and human migration is primarily one concerned with resuscitating the ideology of humanism at a moment in our planetary history when the climate crisis is now threatening to extinguish the human altogether. The other of climate change, the figure of the climate migrant refugee, is a kind of racial fantasy invented to shore up or fix what it means to be human when climate change and the Anthropocene are forcing us, the humans of humanism, to reconsider what being human now actually means. At the crux of what I'm trying to get at in my work on climate change and human migration is the profound humanist anxiety laid bare by the climate change crisis. This anxiety is perhaps best conceptualized with the help of Jacques Lacan, for whom anxiety can be understood to emerge in relation to the real, where the real is that which exceeds symbolization, that which fully escapes the cut of representation. And to me, this excess of comprehension, our inability to comprehend, is precisely what climate change signifies, a kind of planetary incomprehension. As we continue to load CO2 into the atmosphere, we simply have no idea how Earth is going to respond. Climate change is the moment when we fully come to realize just how volatile the planet really is. Planet Earth is making itself felt. And yet we struggle to symbolize this planetary excess. In Lacanian terms, we have no idea what the planet really wants from us, hence our anxiety. Our anxiety is not the result of some founding trauma, like our violent separation from nature, for example. Our anxiety should instead be understood as the result of an overbearing presence of a capricious Earth. We might say Mother Earth, whose demands we can never be quite sure of. The human desperately needs Mother Earth. It makes life possible. And yet even though Mother Earth, whether we like it or not, is always present and never leaves us alone, we remain completely unsure what she really wants from us, which leaves humanism anxiously searching for answers to the unanswerable question, how are we supposed to be in the world? How exactly are we supposed to live on this planet? Mother Earth can never really answer these questions directly, which leaves us having to symbolize the planetary ourselves, which, from a Lacanian perspective, will always be incomplete. So what I've sought to argue in my work, then, is that the figure of the climate migrant refugee is a fantasy other that is invented to resolve this humanist anxiety. My contention is that if climate change can be grasped as a crisis of planetary meaning for Western humanism, the other of climate change, the figure of the climate migrant refugee, does what Europe's other has always done. It resolves this crisis of meaning, serving as the ground for the Euro-Western subject's own self-remaking, precisely at the moment in its planetary history when the Euro-Western subject realizes that its world historical agency, the world historical agency it is imagined to possess, can no longer be guaranteed. I'm sorry for the lengthy diversion into my own intellectual priorities, but I feel that these are really important to put out there because partly what I want to think about today when rethinking the figure of the root as a geosocial formation is the anxiety running through such formations, which is to say that the root is never simply a social or political formation shaped by the material strata of the geos, rock, oil, coal, for example. The root is also a site of psychical investment. Geosocial formations ground imaginaries of selfhood, statehood, gender, race, and sexuality, such that their relentless deterritorializations are what must be avoided in order for our imaginaries to endure. So when everything, even the planet, is a swirl of matter and energy, the root is precisely that which must be rigidly policed in order for certain geosocial formations to persist. If planet Earth is itself not a fixed entity, but a dynamic, fluid process of matter and energy, then it is precisely the root that gives geosocial formations their appearance of fixity. In this sense, we might say that the root is not a signifier of motion or of movement, but the very opposite. The root is a fixed entity, a firm reference point, an enduring presence. The root may appear to be synonymous with movement, but from the vantage of planetary motion, the root is precisely what gives points A and B the appearance of stability in a world on the verge of coming apart. When climate change forces us to confront our incomprehension in the face of a radically unstable Earth, we might perhaps think of the root as a sort of binding agent, a geosocial lacing that holds everything together. So in my time remaining, I'll first suggest how we might rethink the concept of the root in relation to the planetary. This will necessarily mean putting the concept of the root and the corresponding notion of routinization into dialogue with the geological turn. Here I have in mind two recent texts, Nigel Clark and Bron Jarzynski's important book, Planetary Social Thought, which tells us that what the Anthropocene concept demands is that we reconceptualize social and political theory and indeed philosophy through the concept of the planetary. And the second book is Thomas Nail's Theory of the Earth, in which Nail claims that the planet is not, as many of us assume, a stable foundational object on which the drama of mobility plays out. Planet Earth is instead, for Nail, to be understood as a vast process of matter, energy, and motion. In the second half of the paper, I'll use these ideas then to think through routes of labor migration from South Asia, most notably Bangladesh, to the Gulf. Let me start then by outlining what I take to be the assumed or taken for granted understanding of the figure of the route. Here, I take the route to be a habitual or concretized pattern of travel that typically joins up two or more discrete locations. My morning commute, for example. I travel I travel to work every day along a fixed bicycle route. Occasionally, I might walk to work, in which case I end up following a slightly different route along the river. But either way, the points connected up by either cycling or walking to work are identical. I move from my home to my office, following a prefigured route. And it is this which I take to be the primary attribute of the route, connecting up two or more points. That's okay. In a moment, we'll consider the same notion of the route at the scale of the planetary. But before we do that, let us first consider how this simple conception of the route is tied to questions of power. My morning commute isn't just a bike ride or a walk along the river. It is an essential attribute of my work and therefore necessary for maintaining various systems of value. At a societal level, getting workers to and from work requires a route, the routing of workers to and from work along patterns of infrastructure made possible nowadays by the state. Thus, we might say that at stake in the routing of workers is also the routinization of the route. Routes to and from work are made habitual, and in this sense, they become routinized, such that they comprise a significant part of our daily routines. While at the same time, for the route to maintain any system of value, it must also be intensely regulated and policed. Routes are most effectively policed when we don't even realize them as routines. Deviations from established routes or routines invite the suspicion of the police. The etymological origins of the concept of the route can also teach us something. The word route derives from the Latin verb rumpere, to break, and rupta, to open a road by force. There's therefore also embedded in the concept of the route an origin story about the forcing open of a route. Routes don't pre-exist their formation, but are said to be actively forged by an act of breaking open some otherwise impenetrable barrier, a forest, for example, or a mountainside, a desert, or an ocean. Once forced open or forged, routes then become fixed or cemented, at which point they testify to the original act of breaking open. Routes are symbols of the way we've managed to overcome the barriers of nature. There is also a quality of permanence that attaches to the concept of the route. Routes are molar, segmentary phenomena. They striate, and because they striate, they divide just as much as they allow safe passage, a fact all too clear to those living on the wrong side of the tracks. It's also worth reflecting on the gendered aspect of the route. The route is an expression of masculine force, the law of the father. The route, we might say, then, comes to symbolize colonial domination, concretizing relations of domination, systems of value and extraction. Maintaining the route's viability thus becomes one of the most crucial acts in the exercise of power. When routes fall into disrepair, we start to see the early signs that the empire is crumbling. For now, though, there are 3 points I want to draw from this simple discussion of the route. The first is that we should understand routes as necessary conduits for maintaining systems of value. Olufemi Tewa argues, for example, that what he calls global racial empire is formed through motion in time, a set of inertias, gravities, pressures, and bottlenecks that bound and channel the endless flows of the present. To make this point, Tewa uses the example of the Potosi silver mines established by the Spanish in the 16th century. The flow of Potosi silver would not only consolidate the Spanish Empire, it would also be used to shore up the currency regime of the Ming Dynasty. We'll come back to this link between geology, motion, and money in our discussion of the routing of labor from South Asia to the Gulf. The second point is that routes are always accompanied by the means of their routinization, the infrastructures that corral our mobilities, the systems of policing that govern our mobilities, or the ideology of commuting. From this perspective, it's easy to understand why the beneficiaries of specific systems of value invest so much in the routinization of specific routes. The route and its routinization are not only central to processes of capital accumulation, They are themselves specific accumulation regimes. Roots are routinized, regulated, and controlled in order to preserve systems of value, while at the same time, roots stratify social and political life, which means that we can also read social and political stratification off the root. And the third point is that just as we come to appreciate how the root shapes all aspects of our lives, we might also start to appreciate the radical possibilities opened up by a critical reading of the root. They may enable societies of control, but roots can also be redirected to more emancipatory ends. There is, we might say, nothing more terrifying for dominant regimes of social motion than autonomous labor mobility. Let us now consider the root in relation to the planetary. What would it mean to think this spatial figure of the root and its routinization in relation to the Anthropocene? Clark and Dzerzhinsky's planetary social thought offers a useful starting point for answering these questions. Their core insight is that planet Earth has much to offer social and political thought in the moment of the Anthropocene. By planet Earth, they mean not simply the ground beneath our feet, but the vast watery, elemental, molten, spinning planet that orbits the sun along with the other planets of our solar system. Clark and Dzerzhinsky give us two specific concepts that can help us rethink the concept of the root for the Anthropocene. The first is planetary multiplicity. This is the idea that the planet we inhabit is not singular, but multiple. Over the billions of years it would take Earth to take the form of the one we now currently inhabit, planet Earth would undergo periodic episodes of radical instability that would make the upper levels of the lithosphere more or less habitable for different forms of life. We can think of planetary multiplicity in terms of the 5 extinctions that have preceded the current phase of extinction we're now living through. Each of these extinctions was preceded by an episode of radical earthly transformation, convulsions, upheavals, and ruptures emanating from the Earth's inner mantle or collisions with other passing cosmic objects. Planetary multiplicity is an account of the Earth that bears little resemblance to the conventional idea assumed by most social and political thinkers that the Earth is an inert, stable, immutable planet. Instead, planetary multiplicity presents us with a post-gradualist image of the Earth, in which Earth's current geological form is understood to be the result of a series of cataclysmic transitions, as opposed to the slow, gradual unfolding of tectonic processes, for example. Clark and Dzerzhinsky go on to tell us that what they're calling planetary multiplicity was not lost on the early modern European social thinkers. Hegel was an avid reader of geology, after all, and understood all too well what Earth was capable of. But rather than fold the insights of geology into his dialectics, Hegel would deem them as having, quote, no philosophical significance whatsoever. This deplanetization of social thought in Hegel would then pave the way for the legions of social thinkers that would emerge later in the 19th and early 20th centuries, such that planetary considerations were largely forgotten by the writers of 20th century humanism. The planet was something we could reliably call upon to remain in the background of social and political life, allowing humanism to focus on what really mattered, forging a world of human self-determination. Clark and Dzerzhinsky's important concept of planetary multiplicity, on the other hand, is an attempt to reverse Hegel's deplanetization of social and political thought by giving the planetary a rightful place in the human imaginary. For them, any consideration of what it means to be human must be accompanied by the idea that planet Earth has in fact taken numerous distinctive forms over time. Planetary multiplicity names this contingent quality of the planetary. At any given moment, even right now, planet Earth is unfolding innumerable possibilities for becoming other than what it currently is. Planet Earth is multiple because of this potential. The second concept they give us is terra mobilis. Slightly different than planetary multiplicity, this is the idea that Earth is a composite of movement, flows of water and wind, for example, but also rock, mammals, biota, lava, dust particles, ash, and so on. Or a more radical version of the same concept is Thomas Nail's account of planet Earth in his book, A Theory of the Earth. There, Nail argues that Earth is not, in fact, Earth, but a convergence of matter and energy and motion. By this account of Earth, motion is ontologically prior. There is no object, a particle, an atom, a planet, whose movement we then try to quantify. Objects are provisional stabilities or slowed down states of matter and energy. So what then can these two concepts of planetary social thought tell us about the root and its routinization? Well, firstly, they tell us that points A and B, the points connected up by the root, cannot be taken for granted as stable reference points. As Nail put it, quote, our most straightforward definitions of motion as a transition from point A to B assume a static background and internally static self-identical points A and B. Planetary multiplicity and terra mobilis, on the other hand, tell us that points A and B are not actually objective points, but are themselves provisional stabilities in the flows of matter and energy. Just as planet Earth is a container of multitudes, so are A and B. Meanwhile, it is the root, I would suggest, that gives these otherwise unstable places their appearance of stability. To develop this idea further, let us now turn to what is perhaps an unlikely root within the planetary imaginary, the migratory routes that connect up South Asia with this demand for labor in the Gulf, and even more specifically, the United Arab Emirates. This specific route is pertinent to our discussion on the Anthropocene for at least two reasons. First, this migratory route is formed through the historical demand for labor associated with the accumulation of wealth resulting from the expansion of the Gulf hydrocarbon economy in the 1970s. It would be migrant workers from South Asia who would go on to perform most of the low-wage work needed to transform the UAE into a global center for capitalism. It is also the case that many of these migrant workers come from places that are said to be amongst the most vulnerable to climate change, Bangladesh, for example, but also Pakistan and India. My proposition is that we should read the flows of labor and financial remittances that move along this route as precisely that which fixes the route. What is being connected up here are not so much two discrete places as two uniquely opposing expressions of planetary multiplicity. On the one hand, one of the world's largest fossil fuel reserves, itself evidence of planetary multiplicity, and on the other, a site that is being radically recomposed by the effects of climate change. This route is relevant to us because it offers an example of the way the concept of the root and its routinization can be thought as geosocial formations. I'll come back to this point momentarily. But the second reason this route is important for our discussion is because the Emirates are taking planetary multiplicity, particularly climate change, very seriously. We might be tempted by the cynical argument that the UNFCCC has once and for all been co-opted by big oil, exemplified by the fact that the recently named president of COP28, Sultan Ahmad Al Jaber, is also the CEO of the Abu Dhabi National Oil Company. But a less cynical interpretation is that the UAE is investing massively in renewable energy technology because it realizes that sooner or later, not only will the oil run dry, but without an energy supply to power the ubiquitous air conditioner throughout the Gulf, the planet will eventually seek its revenge and risk making the Gulf uninhabitable. From this perspective, investing in next-generation energy technology is not an act of greenwashing, but a genuine effort to ward off the crisis of meaning that climate change threatens to inflict on the Gulf. The UAE's investment in sustainability is typified by Masdar City, a famous eco-utopia on the outskirts of Abu Dhabi, and an important platform for UAE's investment in renewable energy. Masdar City also happens to be chaired by Sultan Ahmed Al Jaber. Now let us consider the migratory route between South Asia and the Gulf in some geohistorical depth. If we follow Neil Ahuja, the formation of this route starts in the mid-20th century when British oil companies operating in Saudi Arabia first began importing Indian workers. But it was the 1973 oil crisis that really consolidated the flow of migrant workers from South Asia to the Gulf. The OPEC oil embargo drove up the world price of oil, which would not only hasten the accumulation of petrodollars in Saudi Arabia and the UAE, but would also cause a spike in global inflation with important political consequences. With inflationary pressures driving up costs in what was then the third world solidarity would start to weaken as non-OPEC countries of the Third World International would struggle to meet their rising costs against now pricier oil contracts. Faced with rapidly depreciating currencies, many such countries would seek relief from the IMF, only to find that its loans and currency guarantees were made conditional on structural adjustment measures, putting much of South Asia onto a path of structural indebtedness that would go on to shape South Asian political economy. In Bangladesh, for example, the expansion of aquaculture and shrimp exports along the southern coast were seen as important means of generating the foreign exchange needed to meet its mounting debt obligations. One effect of this new form of enclosure, however, is that it would displace peasant farmers from the southern coast, pushing them into the wage economies of Dhaka and Chittagong, as well as transnational labor markets in nearby India, but also, more significantly, the Gulf. The result is that transnational migrant labor is now a major export for South Asian economies. In 2019, Bangladeshi migrant workers remitted $18 billion back to Bangladesh, 73% of which came from migrant workers in the Gulf, contributing over 6% to Bangladesh's GDP, such that the Bangladeshi state is now structurally reliant on the Gulf remittance economy. Over 1 million Bangladeshi migrant workers live now in the UAE, the majority of whom are engaged in low-wage construction and domestic labor. Indeed, for many displaced Bangladeshis now living in the sprawling informal settlements of Dhaka, accessing the transnational remittance economy has become an intergenerational ambition. Families will position themselves to access transnational migration such that a daughter working in domestic labor in Rita, for example, becomes a signifier of financial achievement for the family back home. We might be tempted to explain this regime of social motion as the result of the expanding Bangladeshi economy. After all, as Thomas Nail has argued, all forms of economic expansion are accompanied by expulsions of the proletariat from the means of production. In Bangladesh, capitalist expansion of aquaculture is said to be the key driver of coastal transformation, forcing rural peasants to secure new forms of economic livelihood through various migration strategies. However, from the perspective of planetary social thought, we can argue that these expulsions from coastal Bangladesh, as well as the migratory route to the Gulf, owe their existence to the Gulf hydrocarbon economy and US dollar hegemony. This is the geomaterialist argument Neil Ahuja sets out for us. This is not, however, to argue that petroleum extraction in the Gulf causes these expulsions, nor is it to attribute coastal expulsion in Bangladesh to the burning of fossil fuels. It is simply to say that we cannot conceptualize the history of peasant expulsions in Bangladesh without also accounting for the petroleum deposits in the Arabian Desert. More specifically, by acknowledging how coastal expulsions in Bangladesh are shaped by the political economy of petroleum deposits in the Gulf, we can start to appreciate how the migratory route between Bangladesh and the UAE is a geosocial formation. The flows of people and money into and out of the Gulf are subtended by the geological strata of hydrocarbons. But we can also start to appreciate how this geosocial formation is routinized, how the route between A and B and its regularization becomes necessary for maintaining a transnational system of value, one central to both the South Asian economy and the Gulf region. So there's a lot at stake in this route and its routinization. But let's unpack this route a little further with the help of our two key concepts, planetary multiplicity and terra mobilis. With planetary multiplicity, the idea that Earth has transformed itself numerous times before, we're reminded that the Gulf petroleum deposit is an artifact of another Earth. We're reminded that cataclysmic planetary transformation is not an exception to Earth, but a condition of Earth's current form. The Gulf petroleum deposit reminds us that what we call Mother Earth is not uniquely our own, but a maternal figure that has birthed numerous other forms of life, millions of years before the life we now inhabit. Planetary multiplicity comes with the startling realization that Mother Earth bears no particular allegiance to us or to any other forms of life now extinct. While with the second concept, terra mobilis, we're reminded that more than simply a planet that undergoes periodic transformation, Earth is a densely compacted swirl of matter and energy. What appears stable, foundational, and timeless is really just slowed down matter in motion. When we draw these concepts of the root into our reading of the geosocial, when we draw these concepts into our reading of the geosocial route, the migratory route between the Gulf and South Asia starts to look less like a space of mobility in an otherwise sedentary world, and more like a fixed line cut into the surface of an interim fluid Mother Earth. This may explain the recurring image of the line in climate migration aesthetics. It may also explain the fetishization of the line at Neom in Saudi Arabia. Here we might read the root as line as an expression of humanist anxiety in the face of planetary excess. In a world of anticipatory ruination, the line can be understood to serve as a lifeline. Or from the perspective of terra mobilis, the root or line makes the world meaningful to us by fixing our relationship to the other that lives some distance to us at the other end of the line. The line or root, like the other itself, makes life meaningful to us at a moment in our planetary history when it has become all too clear that the planet is on the verge of coming radically undone. By establishing a firm connection between ourselves at point A and those others at point B, we come to a clearer sense of who we are in the planetary context of the Anthropocene. Neither A nor B, coastal Bangladesh and the Gulf, are themselves fixed. Coastal Bangladesh is a massive river delta whose numerous island chars can form and dissolve over a single lifetime. Basan Char, the deltaic silt deposit in the mouth of the Meghna River, to which thousands of Rohingya migrants have been relocated, is reputedly only 20 years old. Its shape continuously changing through continuous processes of sedimentation and erosion. While in the UAE, the desert is an ever-expanding reminder of Earth's mutability. The solar panels at Masdar City need continuous cleansing of sand and dust, just as dust storms are a regular feature of this ever-expanding desert landscape, while the petroleum deposits are an ominous reminder of planetary multiplicity. To conclude then, the debate about climate and human migration is worth reflecting on here. Although climate change is often imagined as a disparate, chaotic, excessive flow of migrants and refugees, the fixed line of the route and its routinization can be understood to play an important part in the political imaginaries of those now seeking to render these flows governable. Expert opinion now tells us that migration is not a problem, but a legitimate adaptive response to climate change. According to this perspective, because human beings have always used migration as a strategy for adapting to environmental change, governments should incorporate migration into climate change adaptation policy. One such policy being advocated is circular migration, such as that between South Asia and the Gulf. The reasoning often used to support this policy is that remittances can be directed to finance adaptation in places where the effects of climate change are expected to be most acute. Bangladeshi migrants remitting wages to their families back home to cover health and education expenses, home repairs, and adaptive upgrades, and so forth. To be sure, this is a progressive policy, but from the point of view of planetary social thought, doubling down on circular migration from South Asia to the Gulf amounts to the intensification or hardening of the route. Here, routes can be understood as a technology of control, a means used by political authorities to mollify anthropocenic anxiety by corralling the other of climate change into regimes of social motion that preserve systems of value. Indeed, just as Mother Earth threatens to force upon us a new Earth, just as she's on the verge of coming undone, we might think of the route as a binding agent, holding in place geosocial formations, showing perilous signs of duress, lines of salvation in a moment of planetary upheaval when what Mother Earth wants from us is never entirely clear. Thank you.